All right, guys, welcome. We are going to get into Unit 7, which is on World War II and the Cold War. There's a lot here, probably looking at least 3 separate videos for this unit, maybe 4. Um, so, where are we here? World War II, the war, the pivotal war in human history, probably, certainly the most destructive war in human history. Some of the major players, Stalin in the Soviet Union, and this, I don't know, this might surprise you, but he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year twice, one of the prolific mass murderers in all of human history. Adolf Hitler was also Time Magazine's Man of the Year, so maybe not a great look for Time Magazine, but just a reminder, these were real people who at the time, were respected and looked up to by certain segments of society. This map here is a reminder that the Nazis and Hitler himself, they were elected. So on this map here, you've seen similar maps of the United States, right? Showing different parts of the country and which parts voted for which party, etc. That's kind of the equivalent here. But it is important to remember that the Nazis were elected, all right? They didn't seize power in the way that the communists did, which we covered in the last unit. They were elected, and like most groups like that, when they get into power, they allowed an election as long as they won, and then as soon as they were in power, there were no more elections ever again. I think I showed you this very same map in the previous unit in terms of the end of World War II, but this just segues right into how or the end of World War I rather. This segues right into how World War II started. One of the main things that Hitler ran on, and that there was wide support throughout all of Germany among many different types of people, was this feeling that Germany was treated unfairly at the end of World War I, and specifically that the territory that was taken from them, which is in yellow and orange on this map, should be returned to Germany. Those territories were full of Germans, ethnic Germans, German-speaking people who consider themselves German and who wanted to live in Germany. So to jump ahead a little bit, when Hitler is in power and he starts invading these territories in yellow and orange, it's important to understand when I say invaded, maybe that's technically the right word, but when the German army went into these areas, no one's shooting at them. No one's resisting. No one's fighting back. The people in those areas were Germans, and they were lining the streets cheering. They wanted to be, reincorporated into Germany. So again, in retrospect, the end of World War I, from a certain point of view, kind of set up the beginning of World War II. Before we get back to what the Nazis are doing in Europe, it's important to realize that Japan was invading and conquering huge parts of East and Southeast Asia even before the Nazis really got going. So when you ask people when World War II started, most of the history textbooks, September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland. Well, yeah, you could say that's the beginning of World War II from a European perspective, maybe. But if you ask the Chinese, for example, when World War II started, it started many years earlier in the early 1930s when Japan started invading China and killing millions and millions of people. So Japan, at its peak during World War II, controlled all of the territory in red that you see on this map. And if you were to draw a circle around that red territory, draw a circle so that the circle would include all of this red territory. If you include the open ocean, which you should, because there's minerals there, there's shipping lanes, there's fish, there's oil. If you include the open ocean, draw a circle around all that red territory, the Japanese very briefly had the biggest empire in the history of the world. Right, this is not a minor thing. So the Japanese were conquering places rapidly before the Nazis really got going in Europe. After Hitler starts taking back this territory that was taken from Germany after World War I, England and France pursue a policy of appeasement. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with that word. Really important concept for you to think about in your own life and to understand how it played out here. Now, technically, when Hitler sent his troops into these areas in yellow and orange to take back German lands, technically, according to the treaty, England and France were supposed to stop him, but they didn't. They appeased. So let's define that word first. Appeasement is basically making a concession, giving someone something they want that you might not want to give them, but giving it in order to avoid a larger conflict. Okay. Now, this is an important idea to think about just in terms of your personal life, and you'll find this out when you get married. You got to pick your battles. All right. You need to make calculations in life. Okay, can I make a concession here without violating, my principles? Is this worth a big fight, or do I just make a concession to avoid a larger problem? Okay. And what the French and the English decided here was, and you should understand this. I mean, you should empathize with where they're coming from. Let me put it this way. The English and the French had just been involved in the deadliest war in human history, right? World War I. The last thing anyone wants in England or France is another war. That's the last thing they want. And you should understand why, right? It was the worst thing that had ever happened. The last thing they want is, hey, let's do that again. There was no political appetite for another war. And Hitler knew that. He was very smart. He understood that they might say, hey, don't do this, but he understood and he called their bluff. I can take back this territory. No one's going to do anything. And the English and the French said, look, those territories that he's taking back, they're full of German people who want him to take them back. And are we really going to start another world war to prevent Germany from taking back territory that was part of Germany until like 15 years ago? Let's just give them back their territory, right? And Hitler is playing into that, and he's saying to the French and the British, all I want is my land back. Let me do this, and then I'll stop. I promise. And the English and the French appease him, and they say, okay, look, that's reasonable. Take back your territory. We don't like it, but it's not worth a big blow up. Take back your territory as long as you promise to stop there. And as you probably know, Hitler doesn't stop. He keeps taking back territory. And then he crosses a line from taking back territory that was part of Germany. And then he starts taking over territory that was never part of Germany. And the English and the French still appease him. And all of the history books condemn, they're like, oh, this is a huge mistake. They should have stopped him early and all these lives would have been saved. Well, yes, that's clear. Hindsight is 2020, but empathize with their point of view at the time. They wanted to avoid another war at all costs. So appeasement just in your personal life, you need to know where to draw your lines, but you also can't turn everything into a big conflict, right? So when does it make sense to make some concessions versus when does it make sense to draw a line and to hold fast and say no more? So it's a really difficult balance, right? And it can be tempting to people want to avoid conflict, so they appease and they appease and they appease. But the danger is if you keep appeasing, you're sending out a message of weakness, right? If you've ever been in a supermarket checkout line and some kid is, screaming to his mom that they want candy, and mom says no, and the kid starts throwing a tantrum or something, and the mom gets frustrated and embarrassed. I'm like, all right, look, just take the candy. She's appeasing and she's avoiding a big blow up in the moment. But then you all understand what's going to happen the next time they're in the supermarket, right? The kid is going to learn the lesson of, my mom will appease me if I make a big enough fuss, and then it turns into a much bigger problem. And that's a trivial example of what happened here. They appeased Hitler to the point where he thought he could get away with anything. Now, after he took back all this territory, Hitler and the Nazis, they signed a promise with the Soviet Union, with the communists, with Stalin, a non-aggression pact in which they promised they would not fight each other. And the reasoning behind that is, if you remember in World War I, and it's the same thing here, the geography didn't change. Germany is in the middle of Europe, and they have a disadvantage because they have enemies on both sides. So what Hitler was trying to do was to avoid a repeat of World War I and to promise their eastern neighbor, the communists, hey, let's not fight. And by agreeing to that, that allowed Germany to only concentrate in one direction in the West, and they were able to conquer pretty much all of Europe because the enemy to the east, the Soviet Union, was not going to attack them because they promised each other they would not fight. And ultimately, that promise gets broken, of course. England and France give Germany an ultimatum. And they say, look, we're done appeasing. And they say to Hitler, if you invade Poland, we will go to war with you, and World War II will be on. And by this point, Hitler had been appeased so much that he didn't believe them, because they had said this before, right? All right, you can take back this territory, but no more. And then 6 months later, Hitler would take more, and they would appease him again and again. So this time, they're like, all right, this time we're really, really super double, triple serious. And he's, this is the boy that cried wolf. At this point, Hitler doesn't believe they're going to do anything. But they do. They declared war on Germany, and England and France made the decision, all right, invading Poland that's a step too far. World War II is on. What is very often left out of the narrative here, because here's how the narrative goes. World War II was necessary because Nazi Germany, a mass murderous dictatorship, invaded Poland. Okay, you might agree that that means World War II is necessary. You can't have a mass murder dictator invade Poland. Well, you know what else happened at the exact same time? The Soviet Union also invaded Poland. The Soviet Union was also a mass murdering dictatorship. So the Nazis and the communists both invaded Poland at the same time. And you can see on this map that Poland lied right in between the two countries, these two murderous dictatorships. And they both committed the same crime at the same time. They divided Poland pretty much 50-50 and wiped it off the map. And what England and France does is declares war on Nazi Germany, but not on the Soviet Union. So two mass murdering dictators commit the same crime at the same time. They both invade Poland from different directions. They both take half of Poland and erase it from the map. And the reaction from the French and the British is to declare war on one mass murdering dictator, but not the other. To declare war on Hitler, but not Stalin, even though they committed the same crime at the same time. Because they decided that Hitler was more dangerous. And this is the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, Winston Churchill. You probably heard of him laying out that thought process using an analogy. If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. In this analogy, hell is the Soviet Union and the devil is Stalin. And so what Churchill is saying here is, if Hitler and Stalin go to war with each other, which they did, ultimately. I'll get to that. Let me jump ahead 1 second. I'm going to get to that next. Hitler and Stalin promised not to fight each other. They cooperate in erasing Poland from the map. And then Hitler betrays Stalin, breaks that promise not to fight, and Hitler invades the Soviet Union itself. So now the Nazis and the communists are at war. These two mass murdering genocidal death cults are at war with each other. And this is Churchill saying, again, the Soviet Union is hell in this analogy. Stalin is the devil. But he's saying, hey, the devil is bad, but Hitler is so bad that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I, Winston Churchill, the British, the French, and eventually the Americans agree with this. I am going to take the position that as bad as the devil is, as bad as Stalin is, Hitler is worse. Therefore, if Hitler goes to war with the devil, Stalin, we're going to pretend that the devil, Stalin, isn't that bad. And we're going to help him fight against Hitler. And so here's what happens. In this map in blue is all the territory that the Nazis had conquered, essentially all of Europe. They could not conquer the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom has that water separating it from the rest of Europe, so they're protected. But they had conquered all of Europe. And then in the middle of the map in light blue, that's part of the Soviet Union. So they invaded the Soviet Union itself. And if you can see, so look at that light blue territory. That's all parts of the Soviet Union that the Nazis took over. It's almost as big as all of Europe itself, right? It's a huge part of the Soviet Union. They conquered huge chunks of the Soviet Union. And at this point, the Nazis controlled essentially all of Europe. The British are holding out barely. And it looked like the Soviet Union was about to collapse as well. So this thing was, by most people's predictions, pretty much over. And the Nazis had this thing won. But then it turns. So at the height of Nazi power and Japanese power, the Nazis controlled basically all of Europe. The Japanese controlled huge parts of Asia, and the Soviet Union is in between the two of them. After conquering France and most of the rest of Europe, Hitler turns east and attacks the Soviet Union. Again, that's violating the pact that he made, but if you're surprised that Hitler broke a promise, you're insane. This theater of the war, just the part of the war involving the Nazis and the communists, Germany and the Soviet Union, that part of the war alone killed 36 million people. We're not even talking about Japan. We're not talking about the United States. We're not talking about China. We're not talking about the British, the French, just the Nazis and the communists. Just that part of the war was the equivalent of double World War I. And this was the most violent thing that had ever happened in human history. Because if you have two governments, the Nazis and the communists, with total disregard for human life, right? They're not taking prisoners. They're not trying to avoid killing civilians. This was just death on a scale that's never been seen before. And you have two of the worst monsters in history going to war with each other. And the policy of the British, the French, and the United States was to help Stalin, to help the communists. As Germans advanced into the Soviet Union, Stalin orders a scorched earth policy. I am pretty sure earlier in the course when we talked about the French Revolution and when Napoleon ended up invading the Soviet Union, it was the same thing. But just to be clear, just to review, Stalin orders his own people, who he cared nothing for, to destroy their own villages if the Nazis were getting close. And the logic behind that order was, if you destroy all of your own buildings, animals, crops, by the time the Nazis get there, they have no place to sleep and nothing to eat. Okay, so let me go back to this map really quick. All of that light blue area, again, that's huge regions of the Soviet Union that the Nazis conquered. However, what are they actually conquering? They're conquering burned down villages. They're conquering a wasteland. So they're going further and further into this huge territory, but they have no shelter, they have no food, and then it gets cold. And that's where things start to reverse. At the end of 1941, the Soviet Union is almost collapsed. The Nazis have taken over a huge portion of the country, as I showed you on that map. They're right outside the capital of Moscow. And it seems like the Soviet Union is, days away from total collapse. And that's when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the United States declared war on Japan because Japan attacked us. So just like World War I, most Americans did not want to be involved in this war. However, when we get attacked, we're at war whether we like it or not. So there's no choice at that point. Japan attacked us. All right, we're at war with Japan because they're at war with us. However, super important that you understand this. The United States did not declare war on Germany because Germany did not attack us. We did not declare war on the Nazis because the Nazis did not attack us. So how did we end up getting involved in the war against the Nazis? Get to that in a minute. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? Everyone has a reason for doing stuff, even if you disagree with their reasoning. So it's not like they just randomly woke up one day and decided, hey, let's attack Hawaii for no reason. Their perspective was they had to do it as a preemptive strike because President Roosevelt had an embargo against Japan. And this graphic lays out what that means. The United States, because Japan was invading all these places in Asia, the United States cut off, that's an embargo. We refused to allow them to get this stuff, cut off access to steel and oil. And Japan bought most of those supplies from us. So if we refuse to sell steel and oil to Japan, it can't fight the war. So we're trying to starve out their economy and get them to stop doing what they're doing. And they don't want to stop doing what they're doing. So they decide, all right, the Americans are trying to, choke us out by denying us access to steel and oil. We need to attack America preemptively. We need to throw the first punch to try to knock them out, to try to destroy their navy, much of which was in Hawaii. And that's the Japanese perspective. Now, this is a huge turning point here, something that might surprise you, but it's important to understand how this happens and think about an alternative timeline where this didn't happen. So in retrospect, most Americans kind of assume that we went to war with the Nazis because the Nazis were evil and they were committing genocide. And of course we had to stop them, right? That's not what happened. That's not what happened. The Nazis declared war on us. That's the only reason we got into this. Why did Hitler make this decision? And in retrospect, this was his fatal decision. If he didn't do this, he probably still would have won the war and we'd be living in a much different world. But he declared war on the United States. Pro tip, my friends, do not declare war on the United States. Bad move. But he did. So here's what he was thinking. This is right after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and now the United States is at war with Japan. The Nazis and the Japanese were allies. And Hitler, here's what Hitler's thinking. The Japanese and the Americans are now at war. Now, why would Hitler take it upon himself to declare war on America? That's crazy, right? Here's what he thought Japan would do. He's thinking to himself, all right, Japan is my ally. Japan's in trouble with the Americans. I, Hitler, am going to declare war on America to send a signal to Japan, hey, I got your back. I'll help you fight the Americans. And what he expected Japan to do, look at the map. What lies in between Japan and the Nazis? The Soviet Union, you see? At this point, the Nazis have almost destroyed the Soviet Union. They're barely holding on. Hitler expects that Japan will repay him by saying to the Japanese, hey, I got your back. I'll help you fight the Americans. He's expecting Japan to say, well, thank you. In return, we, the Japanese, will help you, Hitler, finish off the Soviet Union. Because again, look at the map, look at the geography. If Japan had invaded the Soviet Union from the Pacific area, while Nazi Germany was invading the Soviet Union from the Atlantic side, you see, you'd have the Japanese and the Nazis both invading the Soviet Union at the same time from different directions. And now the Soviet army would have to fight two enemies in two totally different directions. And that, if that had happened, the Soviet Union could not possibly have won that war against the Japanese and the Nazis at the same time in two different directions. And the Soviet Union would have collapsed. And look at the map. Presumably, the Nazis would have taken a big chunk of the Soviet Union in their part of the world, in the European area. And the Japanese would have taken a big part of the Eastern Soviet Union in the Pacific area. And the Nazis and the Japanese would have destroyed the Soviet Union, each conquered maybe half of it. And then the Nazis and the Japanese would have controlled, imagine on this map, if the Soviet Union is all red, the Nazis and the Japanese would have controlled all of Europe, all of Russia, and all of East Asia. And if that had gone down, there's no way the Americans could have done anything about that. You see what I'm saying? And this is a crazy what if in history, but the Japanese didn't do it. The Japanese didn't invade the Soviet Union to help Hitler finish them off. The Japanese sold him out. They were like, "Oh, you declared war on America, Hitler? Thanks." And then that was it. So Hitler, huge mistake on his part. He picked a fight with the Americans, expecting that the Japanese would repay him by finishing off the Soviet Union, and then these two countries, Japan and Germany, would control essentially the entire northern hemisphere before the Americans could even raise an army and get materials going. And the war would have been over, and we'd be living in a much different world where the Nazis and the Japanese won the war and controlled all of this territory. If that had happened, the United States couldn't have possibly done anything to reverse that. But the Japanese sold out Hitler, did not do what he expected them to do. And in retrospect, that was Hitler's fatal mistake. In terms of what happened in the United States after Pearl Harbor, widespread collective guilt placed on the Japanese American population. And it wasn't just from random individuals like this woman. It was from the government, from the president himself. All persons of Japanese ancestry were rounded up, told to come to the train station with what they could carry, and sent to concentration camps for the duration of the war. Didn't matter if they were American citizens. They were all rounded up. They were treated as collectively guilty of potentially being spies for Japan. They didn't need to prove that any of these people were spies. They just rounded them all up because of their DNA and sent them to prison camps. And it wasn't a secret, right? It's very well-known public policy from the president. Everybody knew about it. A lot of the propaganda posters, I showed you propaganda posters for World War I. A lot of the propaganda posters in World War II aimed at Japan depicted the Japanese as subhuman, as rodents, as cockroaches, as rats, as things that needed to be exterminated. The propaganda posters aimed at Germany was much different. It was all about the Nazis. It wasn't saying that Germans are rats and cockroaches that need to be exterminated. The propaganda against Germany was strictly about the Nazis. They're not bad people. They just got taken over by this crazy guy, and we need to get rid of them. So the propaganda posters were much different. Food was rationed throughout the United States for the duration of the war. And we're going to get into the Holocaust now, which I know you have prior knowledge on, but I just want to go through it quickly and maybe add a couple details you might not be aware of. First thing I want to make sure you understand is the sequence. So again, there's this kind of narrative in the United States that goes like this. We fought the Nazis because the Nazis were committing genocide and we had to stop that evil crime. That is not what happened. Again, the Nazis declared war on us for reasons I just tried to explain. Number two, when that happened, the Holocaust as we know it hadn't started yet. The gas chambers hadn't started yet. The gas chambers start after the United States enters the war, after Hitler declared war on us. So by definition, we didn't get into the war to stop the Holocaust because the Holocaust wasn't even going on yet, okay? Holocaust started in full force with the gas chambers after the United States entered the war and after the Soviet Union starts pushing the Nazis out of the Soviet Union. In other words, and after Japan refuses to help the Nazis and it looks like the Soviet Union might actually survive, and then there's the winter and they start pushing the Germans, the Nazis out of the Soviet Union. So in other words, let me rephrase this. The gas chambers started after it became clear to Hitler that he might lose. Okay? It's really important you understand that psychology. He started the mass murder of Jews after he realized he might not win the war. Because when he realized he might actually lose, who did he blame? Did he blame himself for declaring war on America and getting played by the Japanese and invading Russia when it was going to be winter? No, he didn't blame himself. He blamed the Jews. It's a psychosis. On this poster, you see, if you're familiar with The Wizard of Oz, right, that imagery of the man behind the curtain who's really controlling everything. It's a German poster from the time. Who's the man behind the curtain? Who's in charge of everything? The Jews. The way the process of discrimination against the Jews started right after Hitler came to power a few years earlier was with a series of laws called the Nuremberg laws. In this image here is how the Nazis would classify in their minds who was Jewish. And so they had all these categories where they would decide whether a person was Jewish. And if you look at the top of each category, there's 4 circles, and those represent your grandparents. And so the Nazis had this kind of pseudo-scientific way of determining who was Jewish. But if they decide you're Jewish, you are subjected to these laws. You can't, own certain amounts of property. You can't serve on a jury. You can't vote. You certainly can't own a gun. You can't marry outside of your race. A lot of those laws were actually based on Jim Crow laws in the American South. Nazis built concentration camps for all people who were not good Germans. That would include Jews, obviously, handicapped people. Anyone with a physical or mental handicap was considered a weak link and almost like a cancer that had to be separated from the healthy body of the good Germans. Homosexuals, the Nazis, and many others during this period, but the Nazis specifically considered homosexuality to be a mental disorder, a mental illness, and therefore they had to be separated from society. Communists, anyone who didn't fall into the Nazi ideal of a quote good German was put in a concentration camp early on. But the point is, these aren't death camps yet. We're not talking gas chambers. We're talking concentration camps. And as a reminder, unfortunately, there were concentration camps inside the United States too, for Japanese Americans. All right. When the war starts turning and it seems like the Nazis might lose, that's when the mass killing starts. But before the gas chambers were ready, they would carry out the mass killing by doing things like this. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, for example, as they're moving through Ukraine, they would come to a village and they would separate the Jews and they would have them dig a ditch and they would spend all afternoon shooting them in the head one at a time and dumping them in the ditch. A couple things about this. I don't know if you've ever wondered to yourself, how did the Nazis identify who was Jewish? It's not always obvious. If a bunch of young German soldiers who are your age are in Ukraine, they've never been there. They don't know the culture. They don't speak the language. How do they identify who's Jewish so quickly so that they can separate them out and kill them? And the way the Nazis identified the Jews and found the Jews was that the local people, the Ukrainians, for example, were all too happy to turn in their Jewish neighbors to the Nazis. This is a very often overlooked part of the Holocaust. After the fact, everyone rushes to blame the Germans, which, yeah, the Germans were guilty, of course, but the Nazis had a lot of help all throughout Europe, in France, in the Netherlands, in Poland, in Ukraine. Very, very often, European Christians were all too happy to hand over their Jewish neighbors for death. And then after the war, They all acted like they had nothing to do with it, and it was just those crazy Nazis running wild. They had a lot of help. And that's an unfortunate reality you need to understand. Now, this image here, why? So there's a reason why the Nazis stopped doing this method that you see pictured here and went to the gas chambers. Here's what they found out. Look at the German soldier who's about to execute this guy, throw him in the ditch. This is a young person, probably your age. And what the German officers found out was the average 19, 20-year-old German soldier was not a monster, was not a sadist who gets off on inflicting pain on other people. The average 19, 20-year-old German was not a heartless murderer. The average 19, 20-year-old German was just a 19 or 20-year-old who grew up under the Nazi government and who thought that their country was right, and they were soldiers, and there's honor and pride in being a soldier. However, what you see here is not war, it's not combat, it's not soldiers fighting other soldiers. This is murder. This is not combat. There's no honor in this. So what the German army found out was that the average 19, 20-year-old German who thought they were doing the good thing, defending their country, honorably wearing the uniform, when they were ordered to murder unarmed civilians, that caused serious problems. You tell an average 19-year-old, well, look at the picture. Shoot this guy. What did he do? He's unarmed. What are you talking about? Doesn't matter. Shoot him. Okay. And they might say, well, he is a military age male, I guess, maybe. All right. But then you think everyone in that ditch is a military age male? No. So these 19, 20-year-old kids are, shoot that guy. He's unarmed. Doesn't matter. Shoot him. See that woman over there? Shoot her. You want me to shoot a woman? Yeah, shoot that woman. She's holding a 6-month-old baby. Yeah. What's your point? Shoot the baby. Now, what happens to the average 19, 20-year-old when they're ordered to do things like that? Well, if they follow the order, a lot of them, after doing things like this, shooting women, shooting children, you know what they did? They lost their minds. Some of them committed suicide out of guilt and shame. That's not good for the German army. Some of them refused to follow the order in the first place. That's not good for any army, refusing to follow orders. Some of them drank themselves into oblivion to forget what they had done. That's not good for an army. Some of them deserted and said, you know what? I didn't sign on for this. I'm not a murderer. I'm out of here. That's not good for an army. So the discipline broke down. When you ask normal 19, 20-year-olds to murder children, significant numbers of them will break. And that's actually good news, right, for humanity. These are human beings. Doesn't matter what uniform they're wearing. They weren't monsters. And so the Germans realized this is not working. This is not good for discipline. This is not good for morale. We need a more efficient, hands-off way of killing. If that makes sense? And that's where the gas chambers come in. The gas chambers are more out of sight, out of mind, and it requires fewer Germans to do it. And so you can set up a gas chamber in a death camp and find a handful of hardcore sadists who actually get off on suffering and other people's misery. And you could have a handful of heartless psychopaths just funneling huge numbers of people into the gas chamber. And it's much more efficient, and it doesn't require having normal, well-adjusted 19, 20-year-olds murder people in cold blood. I don't want to dwell on this too long, but this is what they're doing, okay? Even after Germany was losing the war on all fronts, obviously, in the interest of time, we're skipping over a lot, but basically, the Soviets, because the United States is giving the Soviet Union unlimited supplies of guns and tanks and trucks, the Soviets now are starting to push the Nazis out of the Soviet Union, and the Nazis are retreating from other directions as well as the United States is about to get involved. And so it becomes clearer and clearer that Germany's probably, they're not in good shape. They might lose this war. They're retreating. You would think that the German government, that Hitler would say, okay, you know what? This is not going well. We're retreating back to our own borders. We need to use all of our people, all of our money, all of our material to defend our own borders. That's what you would think, right? But instead, what did they do? They accelerated the Holocaust. They continued to use men, soldiers, money, material, trains, fuel, to do what? To defend their own country from their enemies who now have the upper hand. Well, they continue to divert resources to the murder of women and children. That tells you a lot about this psychosis. They genuinely thought that it was more important to murder 8-year-old Jewish girls than it was to kill enemy soldiers. The death camps ultimately are liberated and the Holocaust is ended only when enemy soldiers physically enter those camps and shut them down. The Soviets are coming in from one direction, the Americans are coming in from another direction. This quote, "Now we know why we're here," this is attributed to an American officer who came into one of these camps. In this picture here, in the middle is General Eisenhower, who was later the president, and a bunch of American soldiers. And in the foreground are dead bodies all over the grounds. The Americans came into this camp, and the Nazis were killing Jews up until the last second. They thought that was the most important thing to do. And the Americans put a stop to it. And this quote here is about moral clarity. Now we know why we're here. There is, again, this narrative in our culture about World War II. It was the good war. You ever hear that? The good war? At the time, that's not what the average American soldier would have thought. Here's what the average American soldier would have thought. For example, my dad fought in World War I. He told me it was pointless. A bunch of his friends got killed. We got nothing for it. And the last thing he ever wanted from me, his child, was to have to do what he did. And all of a sudden, the Europeans once again got us dragged into a war. Why are we here? The average American soldier did not want to be there. Both of my grandfathers were in World War II. One of my grandfathers left for the war while his wife was pregnant, while my grandmother was pregnant with my aunt. My grandfather did not see his daughter until she was 2.5 years old. Do you think he wanted to be in the war, or do you think he wanted to be home in Massachusetts raising his child? The answer is obvious. However, what this quote is about is the fact that once the Americans are there, when they come across scenes like this in the picture, and understand, again, they did not know the Holocaust was happening until they physically walk into this camp and see it. And the average American 20-year-old is like, what the hell is, what is this? What are these people doing? This is pure evil. And the fact that we Americans were able to stop what is just straight up pure evil, mass murder of children, that creates in the minds of the American soldier a moral clarity. Now I know why I'm here. I don't care about the politics of Europe, all that nonsense. This is why I'm here. This is pure evil, and I, as an American soldier, was able to help stop it. So that's good for morale. Did most Germans know what was happening? Rhetorical question. But this is another photograph of one of the death camps. In the background, all those people standing up are Germans who lived in that town outside the gates of the camp. In the foreground is hundreds of corpses of freshly murdered people. And if you can see, there's 2 or 3 guys standing up in the middle. Those are American Army officers who went into that camp, shut down the gas chambers, and then went out into the town and pulled in all the German civilians and made them look at this. And they're confronting them like, are you actually going to tell us you didn't know this was happening? So let's answer this question honestly. Did most Germans know what was happening? Of course. To some degree, of course. All their German neighbors disappeared. Where'd they go? No place good. They knew to some degree what was happening. Of course they did. Now, we can condemn them for not doing anything. Or I could ask you this question. All those people in the background of this photograph standing up, looking at this pile of corpses, what do you think would have happened to them if they had tried to interfere with what the Nazis were doing? You know what would have happened to them. They would have moved from the top of this photograph to the bottom. They would have been in that pile of corpses. So, you know, we can condemn them for not stopping their government from committing this horrible crime, or we can empathize with the fact that if they did try to stop them, they'd immediately be murdered. But yes, they knew. All right, it wasn't a secret. After the fact, everybody tried to act like they had no idea, but you guys are too smart to fall for that. Some of these camps are still in existence, left as memorials, not obviously to celebrate what happened, but just to remind people, hey, this really happened. This is what people are capable of. This is an entrance to a gas chamber. It says shower. You know it's not a shower, but the Nazis were very good at this. They would actually, when Jews would get off the train, before they sent them into the gas chambers, they would very often, they'd be playing classical music on loudspeakers. They'd have nice flowers and nice landscaping outside of the gas chamber. They would give the people that were about to be murdered, they'd give them towels and soap to try to really play up the sense that like, hey, this isn't so bad. Like, this place is kind of nice. They're playing music. They're going to let us take a hot shower, just to lull them into that false sense of security. And then you know what happens after they walk through that door. You know, and the conditions, of course, were designed to almost guarantee death, if not from direct murder, from disease, which ran rampant because you would have, you know, dozens of people crammed into these little bunks. So I want to, let me segue here. I think I'll just keep it moving. We're going to go a little bit over an hour here, but let's get to the end of the war, to how this winds down. This is an image of the first Americans approaching the coast of Nazi-occupied Europe. If you've ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, they dramatize this very graphically, right? Thousands of these young Americans were killed on this day alone. But after the Americans are able to land in France and get control of this one beach, then they can flood the area with unlimited amounts of, you know, well, huge numbers of soldiers, not unlimited amounts of soldiers, but basically unlimited amounts of tanks, trucks, planes, artillery shells. And so similar to World War I, once the United States is in, the outcome is inevitable. It's just a matter of time. It's a propaganda poster from the time showing the strategy of, right, crushing Hitler between different directions. Some of the tactics that were used, you know, Machiavelli, the ends justify the means. The United States used bombing to destroy entire towns and cities before American troops were sent on the grounds through them. And so on this photograph, you can see all those bomb craters. You can see how close together they are, how sometimes they actually overlap with each other. So this is not like the weapons we have now, which are super, super precise. That technology didn't exist back then. So the target, it wasn't like, hey, there's a Nazi headquarters in this building, blow up this one building. The target was, there are Nazis in this town, destroy the entire town. Did that kill huge numbers of innocent people? You bet it did. What was the alternative? Don't destroy the town with bombs. Instead, send American soldiers in on foot. That might have led to less civilians dying, but it would have led to many, many, many more American soldiers dying. So this was the policy. Bomb the city first, even though it's going to kill innocent people, because we don't want to just send in the Americans on the grounds to an intact city where Nazi soldiers could be hiding anywhere, because that's going to be deadly for the American soldiers on the grounds. Most victims, of course, in this type of war are totally innocent people that have nothing to do with anything. This is the nature of modern war. Ancient warfare, and really all warfare, honestly, up until World War II, the majority of people that were killed were soldiers. World War II changed that. And for every war since World War II, the majority of people killed because of the technology are civilians, total innocence. It's a city in Germany, American plane flying overhead, carpet bombing. We don't have the technology to be more precise. Whole cities of human beings were burned down intentionally. That was this. Those are the tactics that the United States was prepared to use to end this war and to prevent American soldiers from dying. Huge numbers of American soldiers did die, of course, but the idea was even more Americans will die unless we just destroy the cities from the air. The Soviet Union gets to Berlin first. Hitler commits suicide. The Nazis surrender like 3 or 4 days after he was dead. And that part of the war is over. This comparison here, so the Soviets are coming in from one direction, the Americans are coming in from the other direction. The Nazis are getting smashed in between the two. The United States lost 400,000 soldiers. That is a number that we could not possibly comprehend now. That's a huge number. The Soviet Union lost nearly 100 times as many people. Other differences here, besides that incredibly lopsided ratio, all of those 400,000 American dead were soldiers. Out of the 30 million Soviet dead, the majority of them were civilians. The United States lost 400,000. It's an unbelievably tragic number, right? But they're all soldiers, and they were all killed outside of the United States, in Europe, or in the Pacific, in the war zone. The Soviet Union lost 100 times as many people, and they weren't all soldiers. They were mostly civilians. And the war zone for the Soviet Union was their own country. So the differences between the Soviet and American experience in World War II is extreme. The Soviet Union got invaded and destroyed. The United States did not get invaded. The Soviet Union lost 100 times as many people as we did, and we didn't lose any civilians. So the Soviet perspective on World War II, and this sets up the Cold War, which is coming up next. The Soviet perspective on World War II is as follows. We, the Soviets, did 90% of the hard work. We did all the dying. We, the Soviets, are the ones who actually defeated Hitler. And the Americans came in at the last minute. After letting us get slaughtered, the Americans show up at the last minute and act like they won the war. That's the Soviet perspective. The American perspective is, Excuse me, Soviet Union, you are a mass murderous genocidal death cult, and the only reason you even survived was because we, the Americans, gave you endless amounts of money, oil, tanks, trucks, guns, bullets, etc. You're welcome. So you see how those two very different perspectives on who actually pulled the most weight in winning the war is going to set up this distrust that leads to the Cold War. After the war, Stalin ordered massive ethnic cleansing, forcing every German out of every country to the east of Germany. I'll show you the map in a minute. These are not Nazis. These are not soldiers. These are not even German citizens. These are people who happen to be ethnically German in their DNA. I'm ethnically German in my DNA. I would have been included in this group. I'll show you the map in a minute to explain this, but German civilians who had nothing to do with the war, nothing to do with the Nazis, didn't even live in Germany, they were collectively punished for what the Nazis did. And they were forced out of their homes. And during this was the largest recorded mass rape in human history carried out by the communists against innocent German women. And the German women had a saying that it's better to have an American over your head than a Soviet on your belly. The American over your head referred to American pilots burning down whole cities. And the Soviet on your belly is reference to a communist soldier raping you. Here's the map. All of the countries in between the Soviet Union and Germany, so Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc., every person who was genetically German, DNA-wise, was kicked out of the country. They had nothing to do, they didn't do anything, but their collective guilt, right? All Germans got to go. So they're all expelled out of all those countries and sent to Germany. The irony of this is, think about this. So at this point, the war is over, Hitler's dead, and Stalin is collectively punishing every ethnically German person by raping them and or expelling them from their homes, forcing them to go back to Germany. Not back to, they never lived in Germany, but forcing them to go to Germany. And the irony is, think about this, who was super, super, super obsessed with every ethnic German living in Germany and racial purity and separating all these groups? Hitler. Hitler would have loved this policy, but he was already dead. So the irony is Stalin actually did something Hitler would have done, which was to ethnically cleanse half of Europe and make Germany more German than it had ever been. So at this point, the Nazis are dead and buried, thank God. The Japanese are still fighting. And towards the end of that war, things get, I mean, all war is violent, but the end of this war was insanely violent. Some of the tactics used by the Japanese, kamikaze attacks, if you can see in this photograph, it is a Japanese jet suicide attack flying into the side of an American ship to try to sink it. The American strategy is to take over all these little islands in the Pacific Ocean, getting closer and closer and closer to Japan. And the idea was the closer they got, they could use these islands to build runways, and they could have American planes taking off one after the other 24/7, bombing every major city in Japan. During these events, Roosevelt dies, Harry Truman becomes the president, and Truman is responsible for making the decisions involving the atomic bomb. I'm sure you've all heard of the atomic bomb. What you may not be as aware of is what you see on this map, which is a total of 67 cities, every major city in Japan. Every major city in Japan was destroyed by regular bombs before the atomic bombs were used. Okay? And this is very often left out of the story. the atomic bombs were they weren't an afterthought. In terms of the damage done to Japan by American air power, the nuclear bombs were a small minority of that damage. Think about it like this. You see over on the right side of the map, Tokyo, capital of Japan. I'm sure you've all heard of Tokyo. And it says 39.9%, 40%. And in parentheses, it says New York. And you can see that for all these other cities. Here's what this map is saying. Tokyo, for example, you see that 39.9%, and then parentheses, New York. 40%, 39.9% of Tokyo was burned to the ground. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, burned alive. 40% of that city, and then in parentheses, New York. Tokyo is the equivalent size of New York, and 40% of it is burned to the ground before anyone heard of atomic bombs. Right under that, Yokohama. Yokohama is roughly the size of Cleveland. 58% of a city the size of Cleveland was burned to the ground, and on and on and on and on and on. Before the nuclear weapons were used, regular incendiary bombs were used to burn down 67 cities in Japan. And then the nuclear bombs were used. So why did they use a nuclear bomb on Tokyo? Well, because Tokyo had already been burned to the ground. That's why. So the amount of damage that the United States did to get Japan to surrender is very often overshadowed by just fixating on the atomic bombs and totally ignoring everything else that you see on this image. Unlike the end of World War I, the Allies demand unconditional surrender. So this is Churchill from the British Prime Minister. Truman is now the American president. And there is Uncle Joe, the mass murdering monster who all of a sudden apparently is our friend because they considered Hitler to be worse. Unconditional surrender means we're not going to talk, we're not going to sit down, we're not going to negotiate. The Germans and the Japanese, the war ends when you, Germany and Japan, surrender without condition. You lay down your weapons. We, the American army, the Soviet army, etc., will walk into your country and tell you what happens next. Right? This isn't a conversation. This is, we will burn down your country until you roll over and give up, and then we'll tell you what's going to happen to you. Did we accomplish our goals in World War II? Or did we, to quote Churchill again, kill the wrong pig? Well, the pig we killed was Hitler. Who's the other pig? Stalin. Here's how the war ends. And this is a setup, a good segue into the next unit, which is on the Cold War. And this is a very unsatisfying ending. And so let's go back to the mainstream narrative, how most people describe this. They say, and this is in a lot of textbooks and movies and documentaries, World War II was the good war because it was necessary to prevent a mass murdering dictatorship from controlling half of Europe. Because remember how this started? The Nazis, a mass murdering dictatorship, invaded Eastern Europe. Okay. And that means we need a world war? Okay. We can't have a mass murdering dictator controlling half of Europe. Therefore, we'll have a world war which will kill 70 million people. Okay. We can't have a mass murdering dictator controlling half of Europe. How does the war end? You ready? With a mass murdering dictator controlling half of Europe. On this map, the red line to the right, to the east, that's the old border of the Soviet Union. The red line to the west, to the left, is where the Soviet army was when the war ended, but they never pulled back and went back to their own country. You understand? So all of the territory in between those two squiggly red lines, those were territories that the Nazis had conquered, a mass murdering dictatorship, and then the Soviets came in and drove the Nazis out. Good. But then the Soviets never left. So that whole chunk of Europe, half of Europe, the war ends with them trading one mass murdering dictator, Hitler, for another mass murdering dictator, Stalin. So imagine if you're Polish, you get invaded by the Nazis and the communists at the same time, both totally physically destroy your country. The Nazis then betray the Soviets and invade the rest of your country and set up gas chambers all throughout Eastern Poland. And then the Soviet Union comes through again and kicks out the Nazis and destroys your country for like the third time. And then the Soviet Union stays in control of your country for 50 years. Is that a win if you're Polish? That's not a win. The war ended not with these countries being liberated from the Nazis. The war ended with these countries trading one genocidal death cult, the Nazis, for another genocidal death cult, the Soviets. Not the storybook ending that we would have wanted. But I regret to inform you, that's the reality. So keep this map in mind because this will set up the beginning of the Cold War, which is our next unit, and I'll see you then.